everybody. Welcome to this exciting symposium on Irish medium education in Northern Ireland, the role of language teaching and assessment. We have again an exciting group of colleagues here who are going to present you with interesting topics. Without further ado, I'm leaving the floor to Dr. Sultan Turkan for her to give you more details. Thank you.
Let's see, can everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay, perfect. Hi everyone, I'm Sultan Turkan. I'm Senior Lecturer at the School of Social Sciences, Education and Social Work. And I'm delighted to introduce this amazing panel of speakers today. My speech is going to be very short. I call this invocation. I just am trying to invoke the right spirit for our symposium, just to give you a little bit of a background for how this symposium really emerged. Right? You can see we have four papers here. The first one is really the culprit, actually. That paper, the research we did for the IME sector really is behind this symposium. It set the stage and provided the motivation for this symposium. And then we'll continue with a systematic review of special educational needs assessment practices in Irish medium education and global emerging context by Orla and Mel. And the third paper will be by Fionnghuala and Mel on actually providing on-the-ground picture of the bilingual practitioners and people's experiences with test translation in IME sector. And then Eoin and myself will end with a review of, or really a share of promising practices in response to the challenges in the IME assessments. So that's really our overview of the symposium, right? I want to keep it brief there because the papers will speak for themselves. I want to move on to the motivation, really, the background behind the symposium. So essentially in January, February of this year, after our report of the stakeholder experiences was released to the public and was presented at Stormont, we received quite a few letters from stakeholders in the IME sectors, parents and leaders of the organizations, all essentially amounting to one single bottom line question, and that is this translated test valid enough to endorse my child's test score and school admission? So school admission seems often to be a high-stake decision in this land, no matter what the child background might be, in other words, whether the child was born here or not. One email in my own inbox read as follows. The assessment is carried out in two parts. English medium pupils sit an English paper and a maths paper. Irish medium pupils sit an Irish paper, in other words, a bespoke Irish language test with text in Irish and questions based on Irish grammar and syntax, and a maths paper and translated version of the English version. And upon receipt of results, fears around equity were compounded, and anecdotal evidence suggests that Irish medium pupils have been awarded results that are lower than what would have been expected, right? That essentially sets the scenario we are looking at, right? For background and illustration, the stakeholder in the sector had written to the assessment unit with a number of queries that had come up. One of them was essentially about banding of scores. So IME sector raised the question, how were the results banded? Again, were they banded separately, as in 40% of the children who sat the test in Irish were in Gaelic were awarded band 1, or 40% of the total cohort of children who sat the test in English and Gaelic, right? And the response I became the witness to this whole scene, right? The response essentially was banding can only be based on the standardized outcomes. Bands could not be created to ensure that small subset of pupils had the same proportion of pupils in each band as the overall cohort, right? And for me sitting there witnessing all of this query going on back and forth between stakeholders, my response was, wait, I'm not a psychometrician, but I know enough from my experience in the language testing field that item response theory calculations could be actually conducted with small student subpopulations. Differential item functioning can actually be conducted to identify, to examine, excuse me, I'm recovering from a cold, to identify which subset of the population actually is favored over what other subset of the population, right? But none of that, as I understood, is being conducted, right? And so that was my response to this back and forth question and answer, right? So essentially the case and many other queries that we received as a team enabled us to reflect on questions like, wait, how are the translated test scores weighed in relation to the interpretations attributed to these test scores? Do we fully know the validity of the instruments taken to ensure the validity of the translations that are being reported to have taken place? What are the intended and unintended consequences incurred from these tests, translated tests, the scores associated with these translated tests, and the interpretations derived from these scores? Personally, these questions took me to the time in my career when I was working as a research scientist at ETS. I'm looking around any of my ETS colleagues. I don't think they're here. All these memories of walking to the Sam Messick building where most assessment development meetings would take place. TOEFL, TOEIC meetings, you know. And long discussions about validity issues would take place, and when all my graduate school knowledge of Messick's seminal piece, which you see here, on construct validity, kind of would fall into physical form and reality, right? Like almost like going to Hollywood in LA and being disappointed kind of thing. As a graduate student, you idealize these grand frameworks. Oh, I'm in Messick Hall, you know. I would often walk away from these meetings thinking how deeply subjective this very business of validating language tests is. Like it would be like an embodied body experience of like, I would feel this sensation in my bones that, wait, that was very subjective. I thought we were going to talk about numbers, right? You know, some kind of elaborate psychometric model I thought we were going to talk about. That was a subjective panel. Anyway, fast forward to now, I still question, like many others in the field, such as Micheline shall hope de Ville. I couldn't see her today here, but whether we have ever figured out what to do with intended or unintended test consequences since the late 80s when this was published, when Messick was around. In test score interpretations, essentially Micheline, you know, so this is Messick's response to the critique of the consequences intended, unintended, and where they are placed. And then Micheline essentially says, well, and I join her in this question of, are the consequences intended or unintended really only relevant when constructs are misrepresented or not represented at all? So in recent times, we have seen a move towards adopting, you know, firstly the interpretive argument, which was accepted and further enhanced by Baumann, and Carol Chappell and others. Later on, we have come to talk about interpretive use argument by Michael Caine, and as Shalhoub Micheline calls for a social orientation in considering test consequences. All these validity frameworks seem to fail to fully address the question of, is it really feasible to integrate consequences in test validation? I think earlier on this morning, somebody said test validity is a myth even. I don't know. Are we really there? Are we saying this is a myth? The general field of language testing seems to be grappling with questions like, how consequential can assessment be to learning when assessment approaches may not be inclusive of diverse learners? Just a new publication from Jamie Schissel, right? And then why create assessments if not to better understand the test taker, right? So this is just really relevant to diverse test takers all around the world, right? And when we zoom into our Irish medium education sector, we then see like, wow, how well do we understand IME students when they take Irish versions of the English tests, right? Going back to that email chain I shared with you. How well do we understand the intended, unintended consequences of these tests and the interpretations? And how do we create an assessment system that actually works for the IME sector, right? In other words, that values a system that it values, and most importantly, which I care about, is empowerment, values and empowers the knowledge and learning that happens at IME schools. So that was an invocation of our symposium. I hope I set the spirit right here, but these questions essentially hang in air for us as we share in this symposium our scholarly and personal encounters with language testing challenges and promising practices in the IME sector. So we're going to go ahead and start with our first set of presenters with our first paper on Irish medium education in Northern Ireland and the role of language teaching and assessment. My colleague, Dr. Aisling Boyle, will start us off. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I don't think I've ever been called a culprit before outside my home, but I'll take that, and I think Sultan is probably right, it's probably my fault. My role here in this first paper is to take a little bit of a step back to let you know about where these questions, where these letters emerged from. You will notice that our title is deliberately fair, shared, supported with lots of question marks, because when we completed this piece of research, we had more questions than we had when we started. And so some of the questions that we asked ourselves as applied linguists, as educationalists, as social scientists, were things like, Irish medium education, is it fair? Is education fair for all in Northern Ireland? Is it shared? Are the responsibilities, are the obligations, are the duties shared? And who gets supported? Are teachers supported? Are pupils supported? Are parents supported? So this is what we wanted to do. Okay, I will try to make this 2 minutes as per my instructions. Again, just to very make you aware, I know we have a very international audience here, and I know that Northern Ireland is very small, and so I just want to establish some ground facts here. You will know, I'm sure you're very aware, Northern Ireland is a post-conflict society. You will see that has left a legacy of all sorts of issues and concerns, but I want to point very quickly to this one particular graph, which was included in a very recent publication called A Fair Start. So our Fair Start publication was commissioned by the Department for Education in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland has a devolved government, so it was commissioned by local political representatives to examine and to provide solutions to what can be done about educational underachievement in Northern Ireland. So educational underachievement has long been problem, has long been recognised as such. And so our local political representatives established an independent review that was conducted by colleagues here in Stranmillis and elsewhere. That report was made available in 2021, entitled A Fair Start. A Fair Start is really a roadmap for the future of education in Northern Ireland. It is one roadmap, I suppose, for the future of education in Northern Ireland, which tries to point out where some of the inequalities, where some of the inequities are in education in Northern Ireland. Part of that report, when you look at it, there is a mention of Irish medium education. And that mention is where the report talks about a lack of dedicated teacher professional learning in the Irish medium education sector, and the potential that that has to sustain underachievement for children and young people in Northern Ireland. So as a result of that, our colleagues in Coisneacháin commissioned a piece of research to look at one particular area in the Irish medium education sector which engaged teachers. So teachers and leaders on what is it like being an Irish medium educator in Northern Ireland. What is the work that you have to do? What is the workload that you have to do? What are the jobs that you have to do? What are the tasks that you have to do? And so that's the piece of work that we undertook. Okay, just very briefly, it was very much to understand the nature of the challenges that IME teachers face in the education system, IME practitioners, and I'll say a little bit about that later on, about who that actually involves. To evidence some of the experiences of IME practitioners, which surprisingly are rather scantily available in terms of published research, and also in relation to this symposium, we want to discuss those findings in relation to the background that Dr. Turkan has set out for us. Okay, very briefly, and this is going to be a relay race of a presentation, so all four of us are going to take a little piece of this. So I'm going to do this from afar because the next person better be getting ready. So the piece of research that we had conducted, through which these findings had emerged, we conducted a systematic literature review. We wanted stakeholders' views, we wanted interviews with practitioners, but we also wanted to produce an action plan based on what we found together with the stakeholders that we had engaged with. So that's really the format that we go through now, and I'll pass you over now to my colleague Mel. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Mel. I'm going to talk to you just about the systematic review that we did before we engaged in interviews. Pardon the formatting, it's a little messy right now. So the purpose of our systematic type review was just to draw on a comprehensive, wide range of empirical research, just to get a firm understanding of what is already known about immersion and bilingual education contexts around the world. It's a bit tedious, but that systematicity of the process was really prioritized to reduce the risk of cherry picking or bias that can come with more haphazard literature reviews. So in surveying the literature review, we focused on these two questions, and I kind of can't see them. But the first one is, what additional challenges do IME teachers and teachers in other immersive non-ELT language education settings face? And how do IME teachers and other teachers in immersive non-ELT language education settings respond to these challenges, and with what resources? So we cast a wide net across two well-known databases that you see here, Scopus and ERIC. We didn't have a lot of time, so that's what we did. And we got 1,094 hits. After a multi-stage screening process, we ended up with 152 studies for the team to review. So thank goodness there were 4 of us to do that job. I did not read all those myself. So there's 152 articles identified numerous challenges faced by immersion and bilingual education teachers as a result of the model's dual focus on language and content, because that's what immersion teachers do. So we sorted these challenges into 5 categories that you see here in red. There's teacher training, professional development, teaching and learning for both teachers and students, classroom environment, which includes teaching materials, social and affective factors for students and teachers, and then issues related to the profession more broadly. And on the right, you can see these are just an example of kind of the way that we categorized what we were identifying in the literature. So each of these categories represents a pretty rich body of challenges identified. So then in regard to the second research question, we were also looking for evidence of responses to the challenges that were identified. So some responses that had particularly large evidence bases can be seen here in these categories. Sorry. So in many instances, training was seen as a solution. And this could be pedagogical training or linguistic training. Because remember, these teachers are doing two things at once, always. So classroom-based responses to challenges included translanguaging practices and widespread use of teacher-generated materials, as well as institutional and policy responses, such as the formation of partnerships and teaching assistants as classroom support. And I think it's important to note that there is an overwhelming evidence base pointing to responses that fall on the shoulders of teachers. And this is for immersion teachers around the world, not just Irish medium teachers. Okay, so after identifying additional challenges and responses to those additional challenges, we synthesized the evidence across 152 studies to identify additional competencies that teachers in immersion and teachers in bilingual education settings need to have in addition to that pedagogical, dispositional, and technical subject knowledges that are required of teachers in monolingual majority language classrooms. And this is what we have here. So you can see we have these larger categories of competencies, and then you can see sort of the smaller grain size there.
Okay, I said it was going to be a bit of a relay. So the second part of our research was to conduct interviews with stakeholders. The stakeholders that we were primarily interested in were teachers, student teachers, leaders, and teacher educators. Okay, so we wanted school levels, we wanted teachers and principals, but we also wanted to talk to our future teachers. And our future teachers we could find in our teacher education programs. You may or may not be aware, relatively small-ish numbers. Please be aware the population of Northern Ireland is 1.8. So those of you from very highly populated areas, you know the numbers that we're dealing with. So we thought we were really, really lucky. We interviewed 9 people. Okay, and that we were really pleased with that. Just a little bit about that. Each of the 4 members of the team conducted the interviews. We conducted pilot interviews. We wanted to have all 4 of us doing those interviews so that we'd be able to look very carefully over the data that we received and got out of those interviews, and so that we would look at those collaboratively, bringing together, as you can see, we're quite a diverse team with diverse experiences, so bringing all of that background and experiences from different places, different contexts, bringing that together to look at this data. Okay, I am going to take a little bit of a whistle-stop tour all the way through this, where this is available and you can have a look at the data and presentation, if you so wish. It's available online. What we found from these interviews, when we looked at these interviews, we found very, very dedicated professionals. I think that's the very first thing. We have dedicated professionals who are under an enormous strain. And I think that's one of the things that I want to point out. When we looked at began to analyse the interviews, we looked at the current context of IME in Northern Ireland as having these particular issues around additional competencies, additional workload for teachers, IME teachers. I just want to go through at breakneck speed some of these, just to give you a flavour of this. One of the things that we heard repeatedly about was about the lack of resources. Okay, take resources in the broadest possible terms. Resources in terms of actual physical buildings, resources in relation to classrooms that are big enough to hold all of the children, resources in relation to there aren't enough teachers to teach mathematics, resources into course books, reading books, you name it, resources. And so what we find when we listen to teachers, it's not just about there is a lack of resources, but the impact of the lack of those resources. And you can see here, I don't know if you can see it at the back, so this is one quotation which I will read out. It says, 22 years teaching. So this is a highly experienced teacher. 22 years teaching, I am still working to 10 o'clock every night. 10 o'clock every night preparing resources and things that just aren't there. An English teacher can go online and they have a wealth of resources at their fingertips. Ours is very limited. See, I can see that within my age group, a big burnout of teachers because it's easier to work when the resources are there. There are lots of other extracts that I can point out to you, but we tried to capture it here in this picture of this woman trying to push a very heavy wheel. When we looked at other impact of resources. We see this again, the same thing coming through. Everybody wants a piece of me, said one of the leaders from our. There's so much work to be done that leaders and teachers are stretched across their particular schools. There was clearly a lack of understanding from outside of schools as to what the kind of work that an IME teacher does or an immersion teacher does. And that was felt by the teachers who said, well look, it's more than just translation. It's more than just teaching content. You're also teaching the language as well. You're a dual teacher, you're doing double the work. Further to the resources, or impact of resources and the gap, you can see here teacher educators talking about having no expertise in particular areas, or not yet having things like maths teachers coming through Irish medium education, science teachers coming through Irish medium education. We hear teacher educators who are telling us that they feel that their students that they're preparing are not being properly immersed in the way that teacher education in Irish immersion education is currently offered in Northern Ireland. Problematic here is that because it is difficult, because students are not being properly immersed in their words, that they feel that some of the student teachers are dropping out. There just is too much to do. Okay. We have further, we can go through this further, but I know we're kind of running out of time, but you can read here some of the pressures that there are within scaffolding Irish language rich environments, which we know is so incredibly important, and in relation to the professional identities in Irish medium education. We know how important professional identity is for educators, and we can see this being eroded. Okay, I'll pass over now to Sultan, who'll talk to us about what the interview findings were on assessment.
So briefly, essentially the crucial issue of assessment came up in the interviews around, you can see a reference to poor translation, maybe translating from what would be maybe a sophisticated verb put into a very simple verb that really changes it. And so essentially we were seeing incongruity of assessment practices, or maybe lack of valid and appropriate assessment tools for Irish medium education that did not really reflect some of the practices in the greater field of language testing. So many of the practices were essentially reflecting the direct translation from the English version, and in that then we would provide some recommendations, but I'm going to save that for later. I think we are out of time. To the IME sector, we essentially provided a few considerations around item level and policy level considerations based on previous work that was in our team. Okay, so I'm gonna pass these because we need to talk about the action plan. Sorry, this is not working. And hand it over to my colleague, Yecid, so he can have time.
All right, so I got the sign that says to stop, but I'm not gonna stop. I'm just gonna do it for a minute. As you can see, based on the work that we have done in the literature, but also in the interviews with the teachers and teacher educators and principals, we now can say that based on the findings from this research, we developed an inclusive action plan that was not necessarily done in the vacuum, but it was in consultation and refined with the feedback from the key stakeholders that Ashley was saying earlier today. So we designed this action plan with the purpose of enacting a more critical and sustainable practices that meet the needs of the students, the communities, the parents, and overall everybody. So the stakeholders in Irish medium education in Northern Ireland, and many things that we propose within this action plan is to revise the ways in which assessment is being done in Irish medium instruction, both at school level but also in teacher education level. And one of the key things that stood out in this particular aspect was about taking into account that the teachers are already doing in the classrooms. Assessment should be localized rather than standardized. So in a sense, these action plans hopes to recognize the different needs teachers have and how these can be solved from a policy level. So one last thing that we propose in this action plan is that all the necessary things to be done, we hope to foster a greater collaboration and understanding between the immersion teachers, the curriculum developers, the different assessment practices and examination bodies, as well as other people who have been identified as community stakeholders. And as such, we present today a 8-point plan with more details about how all of this can be done. Unfortunately, we don't have the time today to develop or to expand on these 8 action points, but on our website and the research center, you can go in there and find specifically what each one of the action plans are. So yeah, that's it.
Orla.
We're going to keep it moving.
So this is truly a relay race. There are so many of us. So
I'd like to thank everybody for coming and joining us today. My name is Dhaibhín. I am currently in my first year studying PhD, and this is my lovely supervisor, Dr. Engman. And we're here today to talk about how we conducted a systematic review of special educational needs assessment practices in Irish medium education and global immersion contexts. So really just to give you a wee bit of a background information, I am a full-time Irish medium educator in Bunstophic-Grafton, an Irish medium primary school in North Belfast, and I have been teaching for 18 years. I am also the SENCO of the school, which is the Special Educational Needs Coordinator, and a senior leader in the school, and I've done that for 13 years. I have an additional role as an associate lecturer at St Mary's University College, where I teach special educational needs to postgraduate trainee teachers. And really the foundation for my study developed through my career and developed through in particular my practice and my role as a SENCO, and looking at inclusive practices and support structures and frameworks that are in place in IME. Broadly, the aim for my PhD study would be to contribute to developing maybe a model for assessment that is linguistically relevant and culturally sustaining for IME practitioners.
Oh, wait, this is it, right. Thanks, Orla. And so just today, to clarify, so this research emerges from Orla's dissertation project. So while her dissertation focuses on Irish medium education, we're actually going to be focusing on a sort of broader, just as we did with the project that we did for the Coisneacháin, we also wanted to start with a systematic review of immersion contexts around the world to see if we can get some ideas for what is working in these contexts around SEN and assessment. So that's our research aims for this systematic review that we're going to present to you today. So go ahead.
So ultimately, IME throughout Ireland allows children to become bilingual at an early age and aims to provide them with a strong sense of cultural identity and to learn to appreciate and value their language. But there are north-south differences, as can be seen in the research. If you look at the first reference there, that gives you the north perspective, and it states that it involves working class families and the community involvement and empowerment, as well as revitalisation of a minoritized language. If you look at the second reference, which gives a south context, that mentions that it's the language traditionally was enjoyed and encouraged by middle class families, where parents were the main source of promotion. Obviously there are other various factors that contribute to these differences, such as political and historical backgrounds, different demographics, the likes of language conflict and language policy, and community involvement and public opinion. So just these key terms and phrases are important for this review. When we talk about SEN, special educational needs, this is just a term that is used to describe the difficulties and disabilities that make it harder for children to learn in comparison to their peers. So these children are likely to need support, extra supportive provision, or a different way of teaching. And this would be involved in their schoolwork, communication and behaviour, and in a lot of cases elements of all three. So this is known as special educational provision, and this provision can look differently, from differentiation through the curriculum to using different strategies and teaching techniques, to additional adult support, which would be a classroom assistant, and then to possibly being advised for an alternative setting or a special setting, which is based on assessment and evidence. So when we look at assessment, this enables teachers and other professional educators to measure the performance of pupils and to gauge the progress of them or lack of progress. And this helps us and is meant to help us to plan and make recommendations and provide support that is appropriate for their learning need. And immersion education, which is fundamentally an umbrella term used to describe different types of bilingual education around the world, and helps to develop a standard of, or wants to develop a standard of a high standard of competence in the immersion language or in the target language, also known as language 2, but at the same time has to develop this in their first language at the same level, and has to be similar to that reached of pupils in monolingual schools. So what we know from existing literature is that immersion education is widely and effectively known as a very successful form of bilingual education, as the pupils are fully immersed in the language, more or less for the first 2 to 3 years of their formal education. And this can be seen from the works of Baker, Swain and Cummins. We also know that there's been a significant rise in the level of SEN, with the percentage rising to, in this part of the world, under 20% of the school population recorded as having a SEN need. And I think it's important to note that the category that has been recorded is that of cognition and learning, which relates to literacy and numeracy difficulties. So again, there are different possible contributing factors, such as a greater awareness of SEN amongst our educators, or changes in assessment and diagnostic criteria. But evidence also shows that there are significant assessment challenges within IME, with reports that existing SEN assessments that are being used are inappropriate and are very much English-centred. So really what we don't know is how much these challenges, assessment challenges resonate from other immersion contexts, and what we can learn from other immersion settings. This has led us to develop these research questions specific to the systematic review, which is what are the challenges of SEN assessment in immersion education settings at primary level, and what inclusive assessment models or practices are used in global contexts of immersion and bilingual education at primary level in response to these specific challenges.
Okay, so we'll just briefly talk about the methods that were used to collect data for this systematic review. So first we created a search string, piloting terms across several different databases until we were happy with the number of hits being returned with the search string. And then we entered it into those 3 databases you see there, ERIC, British Education Index, and Scopus. And that's trying to find, you can see we focused on immersion education, special education, and also primary school. Okay. So then we screened those 105 articles that came through those 3 databases. First, we removed the duplicates, then we applied inclusion and exclusion criteria to narrow down the search. And we then obtained the articles that were remaining, and we read them and extracted key information regarding assessment challenges and inclusive models and responses to assessment challenges. And here's the Prisma diagram to show what that screening process looked like. And in the end, you can see we ended up with just 13 articles. So just to confess that there were really very few articles that addressed the intersection that we were looking at. We actually were looking for articles that addressed all three of these things: assessment, special educational needs, and immersion, bilingual education, especially at the primary level. There really just isn't much out there. So it was a bit disappointing, especially for someone writing her dissertation. But I will say that we did also include articles that maybe weren't focusing on that as the focus of the research inquiry, but maybe findings emerged incidentally around assessment if there wasn't even the focus, or findings emerged around special educational needs, even if that hadn't been the focus of the study. The articles that we reviewed, they came from Ireland, New Zealand, the United States, Germany, and the UK. And there were several different languages involved: Irish, English, Spanish, German, Italian, and sign language. So we'll tell you about what we found now. Go ahead.
So just to dig deeper into the findings, this is an overview of what was extracted from research question 1 from those articles. There are 7, as you can see, there are 7 overarching things that emerged from this review. And really, to summarise, the literature suggests that many immersion programmes lack the necessary resources and bilingual specialists that are needed to provide culturally sustaining and inclusive guiding support for meaningful assessments and interventions to take place, a matter that certainly needs further research. And these are just some strong quotes that really stood out from the articles, such as the lack of assessment interventions and resources in the language of instruction, as mentioned by Ngandri et al. External services are provided, but they're provided in English, not in Irish, in the IME context. And the pupils transferring maybe to post-primary education or high school education being prepared to compete in English language high-stake assessments. So just to move on to research, the findings of research. Question 2, like Mel has mentioned, unfortunately it didn't shed much light onto the specific practices or models that are being used in different immersion contexts, but certainly shown some responses that could maybe be used to address these challenges, such as evidence-based advice being given to parents in both the challenges and benefits of immersion education for pupils with SEN. Policies in place to ensure suitable interactions and informed decisions are being made, including incorporating pupil and community voice, and the need for greater availability of bilingual services, programs, training and assessment. And again, these quotes do show how assessment challenges might be addressed in different immersion contexts, and it sort of points towards the relational idea of assessments being, as Ngandri states, complemented by other forms of assessment that could possibly enhance the process and give a fuller picture of the pupil's strengths and challenges.
All right, so what we really see in this review is widespread decision making on the part of teachers and administrators who do not have sufficient training or support. That seems to be something that's pretty widespread across immersion contexts. So these stakeholders and the researchers too, they demonstrate a keen awareness of the gaps in assessment for immersion pupils with special educational needs, but with little innovation or inadequate resourcing to address these gaps. So we see an urgent need for culturally sensitive and inclusive models for SEN assessment across a broad range of immersion contexts. And this doesn't necessarily help Orla in her quest for success stories that might serve as models to be critically adapted, but it does contribute to the rationale for her study and for her aim of developing a linguistically relevant and culturally sustaining assessment in Irish medium education, working with teachers, educational psychologists, students, and their families. So Gormag.
Just here.
Hi, Gormago, thanks for coming here today. Me and Mel are I'm familiar with Roibeaird, you know Mel by this point. But we're going to look at some findings on bilingual practitioners and pupils' experiences with test translation in IMA. So the data from this presentation comes from my PhD dissertation, which is investigating the relationship between Yecid, which is the Irish for Irish medium education, and community regeneration using the secondary school College de Forste as a focal point. So College de Forste is based in West Belfast, and it's the largest secondary IME school in all of Ireland. And College de Forste and Gill College de Gura, which was established in 2015 up in Derry, are the two secondary schools in the north undertaking formal A-level and GCSE exams. There has been a difficult relationship history between the Department of Education, which initially was opposed to IMA, and assessment has frequently been cited as an issue for IME pupils and for practitioners. So some background, in the north of Ireland, SEA is the only examinations body willing to translate the mainstream subjects at GCSE and A-level. Irish medium education pupils complete their tests in Irish, but they work off of two papers, and that was mentioned in the first presentation. And the reason for that is that the translation into Irish isn't always reliable. So the students constantly have to kind of go back and forth, so they're thinking in two languages at the same time as well, and there's no extra time given to the pupils unless they have a special educational need. So after they've completed the tests, the tests are translated into English and then marked. So SEA are open to correcting the papers in Irish, but as of yet this hasn't materialised, and this really raises questions of equity in the assessment process. Now, SEA is the only exam body willing to translate the kind of mainstream academic subjects. The Open College Network, which was more kind of practical subject orientated, they were translating papers, and then abruptly, according to one of the respondents, stopped doing that. So the IME sector is now working with a Welsh exam board because they're used to working in different languages.
Great, so I'm just here for the theoretical framing this time. So we looked at theory on language ecology and humanizing assessment to frame the approach to data in this presentation. So an ecological approach to language policy and practice is really concerned with the relationships between the environment and languages and the language users. So relational approaches have gained a lot of traction recently in language scholarship. For instance, Angel Arias and Jamie Skissel, they note the complexity of these relationships. They say language ecology research has expanded to encompass social, historical, sociolinguistic, and political forces at individual, community, and societal system levels. And Jamie Skissel also specifically points to the importance of an ecological lens in efforts to decolonize assessment. She says, rather than used as an overall metaphor, decolonizing means being specific with contexts of relationships to colonialism. So ecological approaches encourage us to ask how policy and practice can create equitable multilingualism. So with that as our framing, our ecological approach to the qualitative data that Fionnghuala has collected asks these two questions. How do teachers and students experience assessment policy and practice within an Irish medium secondary school? And what do these experiences reveal about the relationships within the language ecology for Irish medium education in the North?
So some of the methods, this is a qualitative study. So I conducted 10 weeks of ethnographic observation in 7 different classrooms in College de Forste. So 4 of those classes were test classes, 2 at A-level and 2 at GCSE. So I took field notes primarily because I didn't want to take recordings just to protect the anonymity of the students. And I also took notes on conversations I had with staff and pupils. And then I conducted 13 semi-structured interviews with school staff and community activists or workers. So 8 of those interviews were with staff at College de Forste, and 4 of them were members of the senior management team, either acting or had previously acted as it. So while the study was focused on College Dhaibhín, there was a diverse experience of interviewees, including work experience, which allowed the findings to be generalised to the whole sector. So some of the findings were that there were ongoing translation problems with exams, that there was a failure to adequately recruit Irish language examiners. The Irish version of the test papers was using incorrect terminology, despite there being an agreed list of terms between College Dhaibhín and SEA. So in particular, when new subjects or new specs were brought in, the school would go and draw up a list of terms that they wanted to use that the students understood, and they would give it to SEA. And there had been some teething problems whenever new subjects or new specs had been introduced. There was problems with the translations of the students' papers after they had completed their tests, and then whenever there had been mistakes made, there was problems with the remarking, because the papers weren't just remarked, they had to be retranslated as well, which ate up time, and whenever you had students waiting to get into university and to have the correct grades for university, this created problems. And the second finding was that the translation problems were creating a lot of mistrust. So the students, as I said earlier, were working off of 2 papers because they just didn't trust what was written on the Irish language version. And teachers were having to interrupt exams to clarify the terminology that was being used, which was just creating heightened levels of anxiety for the students. So this was reported to me in an ethnographic conversation with a teacher of her experience with the mixed messaging regarding marking in Irish. So SEA have stated that they've tried to recruit Irish-speaking examiners to facilitate the assessment in Irish. Now, the establishment of Gael College Dhaibhín in 2015 really opened up new possibilities for assessment, because teachers often act as examiners. So whenever you had 2 different schools going for exams, you could have the teacher from one school assessing the others. So a teacher in College Dhaibhín who works as an examiner in SEA has offered to mark papers for Gael College Dhaibhín, which would mean you wouldn't have to do those translations. And according to her, that offer was ignored, so she stated that she just wasn't given an answer. It was someone says, "Oh, go away and check that," and they never came back. So there was also reports of perfunctory recruitment of examiners. So I mentioned earlier problems around the translations of the papers being remarked. So there was a student who actually missed the university spot because his paper wasn't correctly translated, and then there was a delay in getting it remarked. So as a response to this, there was a meeting between the school members of the Department of Education and SEA. So this interview with Gary McRibbert, who was a former principal at College Dhaibhín and was working as the Irish Medium Project Manager at Yecid at the time. Yecid was the body that came in between the library boards and the establishment of the EA. So he reported that a school governor asked why was no one with Irish employed to mark these papers, and a SEA official replied that he had put an advert in the paper but he didn't get an answer. And the school governor asked that they put an advert in any papers down south to try and get someone, and the SEA official replied that he did. Then he was asked when was the last time, and the SEA official replied that it was 5 years ago. Now, it wasn't a question of money. The money was there, but these people are in silos. They're doing a job. They don't need to do more than the job. There was also reports of perceived intransigence to facilitate IME assessment or instruction. So this again is from Gary with his time as the Irish Medium Project Manager. So in a meeting with Katrina Ryan and a couple of education officials at SEA, he said that Katrina Ryan said that she had provided something like £50,000 for SEA to translate things, and at the end of the financial year they gave back 40,000. So that's £40,000 that was there for Gael Yecid that wasn't spent. SEA didn't have the ability or the capacity to do it. They didn't go out to recruit or employ people to do it. They're bringing in translators who for the most part were people with Irish, but they were not people from an educational background. And from year to year, for example, when I was teaching history, you could see that it was a different translator, so there was no one standardising the papers that the pupils were sitting. And then we kind of see the emergence of internalised colonial language ideologies, where English is viewed as the only legitimate language to assess knowledge, and Gaelic viewed as inferior in both the assessment and the instruction. So this interview with Padraig McCahill, who was a senior manager at College de Forste and is now working as a school improvement professional at the AA, he said that when he came back to the school, which was 2008, the results weren't great, and there was people at the time saying, even people with Irish, that maybe we can't teach maths through Irish, and there was a lot of that going around, so we were under pressure. So in relation to the teaching of maths, the test translation problems really begin with resources and proper resources in Irish. So this interview here from Gary says that, and we had a big long list of resources that existed in English and the lack of resources for IME. And I remember at that meeting with Katrina Ruan, she said, whatever College de Forste wants, College de Forste gets. So a new relationship started at the time between us, but Sia, their heart was never in the process. We would send Sia things, they'd come back with excuses, copyright infringement, etc. But they translated the maths textbooks and then they refused to give them to the school. They sat for months in a storage facility in Mollusk. They wanted the school to buy them, but the school didn't have the money. And this was in that same financial year where Sia returned £40,000. And at the same point, we have Mackenzie et al. Being commissioned by Sia in 2018 to research whether IME and bilingualism were inherently barriers to the teaching of maths. So on one hand, you have the refusal to supply resources, and then on the other, you're commissioning research to see if it's inherently a barrier to learning maths. Yeah, I'll let you.
Okay. Okay. So just to summarize some of these things that we read. So in answer to our first question regarding experiences with assessment policy practice, the participants reported an unequitable additional workload for teachers and students. There were reports of unfairness in marking, and there were reports of inequality in resourcing. And in answer to the second question around features of relationships within the assessment ecology, participants describe a long history of contentious relationships between schools and authorities and mistrust between teachers and assessors, along with frustration and fatigue with the Department of Education. Okay. So these findings point to a need for action in the IME sector, particularly at the secondary level, that can develop relationships and strengthen them across the language ecology. And we think that Jamie Skissel's work on humanizing assessment can really help with this. So humanizing assessment builds on language ecology research and ecological approaches, those relations-focused approaches to language policy and practice. So it centers the experiences and histories of language minoritized community members, and it promotes equity in assessment and education. Humanizing assessments gives testing practitioners more information, and maybe different information, so they can grapple with the full impact of assessment work and its sometimes harmful consequences. Skissel identifies 3 features of humanizing assessment. She talks about decolonizing, historicizing, and communing, and she notes that attending to the critical and social aspects of language assessment is a shift. She says, it necessitates a change in priorities from goals and standards of a profession to lived realities of people, which will in turn improve the inclusive, equitable, sustainable efforts in language assessment overall.
No, you don't. So just to conclude, we're wondering if that much has really changed. So in a parliamentary exchange in 1923, the Education Minister, Lord Londonderry, remarked that as your Education Minister, I will not for one moment allow the use of the so-called Irish language in the intermediate examinations for Northern Ireland in the answers to any papers except those set upon the Irish language as the subject of examinations. So we're really wondering, despite the statutory agreements, has much really changed? Irish medium education is the fastest growing sector in the education system, yet rather than its growth being accommodated, IME is required to bend and break to meet the unfair standards of the English language dominated education system. For my good.
Dave. Hello folks, my name is Eoin Coisneacháin, and I am presenting today along with our colleague Dr. Sultan Turkan from Queen's. I work for CCEA. Thankfully, I don't have anything to do with A-levels, GCSE examinations, which is closely regulated by regulation here. So I won't be commenting on it, and I can distance myself from that. So I deal with primary education, and I hope to speak to you today just about sorry, I'll move that on, about some of the developments that we have currently for the primary sector. Mainly, it covers Key Stage 1, 2 and 3, and that's ages 6 to 14. So, just to give you a bit of context then, I'll speak about myself and the sector itself, and some of the current practice in terms of assessment and gaps that have been highlighted in terms of, and some of that will chime with what you've heard here already. I'm going to talk to you about a development that we have at present. It's the SIA CAT project. I don't know if you're aware, but we love acronyms here. And just to disambiguate, CAT is not the cognitive ability test. This is the computer adaptive test, just like we needed another acronym to confuse things. But yes, it's a computer adaptive test that we're developing at present for the Irish medium sector, both in literacy and in numeracy. And my colleague, Dr. Sultan Turkan, will have a word with us as well about test score interpretation. So, just by way of giving some background, the first Irish medium school in the north of Ireland was established in 1971. It was founded by a dedicated group of families who wished to raise their children through the medium of Irish. This was essentially the birth of the Irish medium sector here in Northern Ireland. My own parents were part of that group. I remember them sitting, sticking handwritten pieces of paper to English textbooks and all that. And I was a pupil at that school myself, and went back to teaching it. And I'm very much, as Sultan reminded me, a product of that system. And it has been my privilege since finishing teaching there to be able to support and give back to this sector. Since that first school in 1971 was established, it has gone from one school to 50 preschool settings, 36 primary and five post-primary providers. So there are two fully Irish medium schools, and there are 3 units which provide education through the medium of Irish to some degree. So there are currently 7,414 pupils in Irish medium education. I have that figure from Monday, so pretty current, I think, thanks to Collen. The vast majority of these schools follow an immersive model of bilingual education. And for most of these pupils, Irish is their second language, although that's not the case for all. As is the case with many indigenous and minority languages throughout the world, provision of educational services and support for the Irish medium sector has been scant in the past. In recent years, however, this picture has begun to improve with more support from various bodies. Council for Curriculum Examinations and Assessment has a team dedicated to translating and developing bespoke curriculum support materials and assessments for the Irish medium sector. So schools here have been statutorily required to assess and report on pupil attainment in literacy and numeracy, and in the cross-curricular skills of communication using maths and using ICT for pupils in key stages 1, 2 and 3. So that's ages 6 to 14. Whilst many of these requirements have been lifted as a result both of COVID and of industrial action, schools still require assessment tools in order to effectively inform teaching and learning, in order to benchmark, to diagnose, to track pupil progress and to report to parents. This need is all the more acute in the Irish medium sector, where there is a dearth of suitable assessment tools. There we are. So, SIA currently is developing a literacy and a numeracy computer adaptive test, as I've said. It'll be a standardised diagnostic computer adaptive test for both English and Irish medium sectors. The English medium literacy CAT will be the first bespoke standardised test developed in conjunction with Irish medium schools. The Irish medium numeracy CAT will be a trans-adapted version of the English numeracy CAT. And it is hoped that this will enable the test to be standardised across cohorts. Now that'll be quite challenging to achieve, and it'll be a first that we've tried it, so we hope that this will work. Some of the other talks that you've heard today are coming from a more academic background. Mine is more experiential. We have developed assessments before. We've succeeded in many, we've failed in some. So this is very much a hands-on experience for us. And I have to say it's been great to hear and to work with Queen's and to hear what's happening internationally, because it can be quite a solitary or a lonely endeavour. So, and our aim is to provide, well, it seems that the aim will be in the future to provide system level data. So, as it's perhaps the most challenging of the two, our focus today will be on the Irish medium numeracy CAT, as that is the trans-adapted test. And I know we're under pressure for time as well, so I'll fly through this. So, so obviously some of the major challenges that we face are not unique to Irish, but a lot of these will be familiar to a lot of you. And in trans-adapting items, for instance, there can be a tension between ensuring that the rubric of the item is appropriate to pupil reading age, for instance, whilst not providing any advantage or disadvantage that would affect the performance of the item across the cohorts. We have found that whilst it's important to adhere to the rubric, that we have to ensure that unfamiliar vocabulary or complex grammatical structures are not introduced that would present additional hurdles to pupils in their second language, and that's a fine balance to achieve. There are also questions of dialect, obviously, with all translation. These are the considerations that we're plagued by is issues of dialect and register, and in particular age-appropriate vocabulary in a second language, and I think that's something that isn't very often taken into account. And also the socio-cultural relevance of items as well, to ensure that there is no bias. One particularly challenging element is in the English medium numeracy CAT. There is a function there for text to voice for any children who maybe have reading difficulties. They can listen to the question. This facility isn't currently available in Irish. There are some commercial companies working in that field, and AI is increasingly being used for that, but we don't have currently a suitable vehicle for that at present. We are looking at other options, for instance, voice recordings, but to go through thousands of items and record them and whatever would be quite a mammoth task. And of course, we have to do what we can to avoid translation error, to ensure equivalence across both language versions of the test, and to allow for standardization across the cohorts. Some of the opportunities that we're talking about here, we look for past or present practitioners in writing the items, and our guidance to them is very much on the construct and the primacy of the construct. It doesn't matter so much how it's dressed up, but it's what is being assessed that is key, and to ensure that sometimes in translation, when things are translated, you can very quickly and very easily add a whole new level of difficulty to a question. So that's a major element for us as well. Also, involvement at the development phase, so that we can circumvent any issues for the trans-adapted version. Avoidance of superfluous text. Back translation is another strategy that we use. And we have a robust QA process with, I think it's 5 different stages there of QA to ensure that the items are suitable for the target audience. We also carry out pilots and feedback sessions from those. I'll invite Sultan to speak to you about some of the others.
Thank you. So our conversation really organically emerged at Malone House when we first presented our work from the first paper, and Eoin and I have had extensive conversations whereby I was sharing some of my past work at ETS around translanguaging accommodation, or an interface that we developed to incorporate translanguaging features. And we talked about cognitive interview process, but potentially to be integrated in the translated or trans-adapted versions of the English test, and I shared some of the pictorial gloss accommodation features that we had developed that could potentially be incorporated in the current version or the current practices of the assessments that could at least enhance the construct equivalence and some of the enhanced construct equivalence dimensions of translated tests. But not only that, but also to help enhance the test validity. So in our conversations then, I was sharing with Eoin how as a point of opportunity, right? How a translanguaging interface could invite the students to pick a body who would read aloud, as you can see here, read aloud the test item to the student in the English or the Irish version, right? And but this is an interface we had developed in the US between English and Spanish, right? And another feature is looking at synonyms of construct relevant phrases embedded in the item, right? So this is just Spanish version of the same, or if the student is not capable of responding in writing, they could actually orally respond, right? So this was just for illustration. I was exemplifying for Eoin how we could envision and visualize a future where translanguaging features could be embedded in translated versions of the essentially the English text, because English is quite the driving language in assessment design in the IME sector. And this is just to show from our previous work around pictorial gloss and how some of the construct relevant words could be pictorially represented for the test takers to facilitate their understanding of the Irish test. So test score interpretation is a real issue. Circling back to my first introduction of the symposium, right? And we have, I guess, heard instances of test use and test misuse within the IME sector. And I guess the question that I'm going to leave us with in our session with Eoin is to what extent do the test use and test misuse over score interpretations get systematically examined in relation to the inferences made on test performance. And I am really informed by Kane's interpretive argument and interpretive use argument frameworks when I ask this question, and those inferences are really key, because in my conversations, in my work with Eoin, I got to see that these panels of test translators do not necessarily involve a psychometrician, for example, which is a pretty standard practice elsewhere in some of the other translation, some of the other translated assessment contexts, right? So I won't go. I can go into. We are out of time, but essentially, if we are making inferences about students' test performance, we need to have a series of psychometric as well as qualitative measures in place to ensure that the inferences that are being made from those test scores are actually valid, right? And in the decision level inference is the one that is most crucial, because it then leads to the decisions and conclusions about the student and where the student could go after the test. Hence my comment at the very beginning about school admission, because some of these students cannot, go to the schools that they wish to go, as Fionnghuala was also sharing with us. Okay, so we're going to end here and invite our discussant for commentary.
Over as well. Yeah. See if these microphones.
Yes.
Dia Dave Akarja, es Misha Ian, es a spell farce to me. Je parle français, ich spreche Deutsch, hablo español, I speak English, Tagerga Agam. And thank you very much, Aisling.
I hope you can all see that when we say that we can speak a language, we always say, I speak French, I speak German, I speak Spanish, I speak English, But in the Irish language, it's Tá Gaeilge agam, and that translates as the Irish language is on me, or I have the Irish language is a part of me. And the language itself is certainly very, very shared, and the people who live in this part of the world are all entitled and speak the Irish language from what we can see and hear around our city. But what we can see from today, and I hope that my languages were not lost in translation, but we can see today that languages have been lost in translation within our education system, particularly in relation to assessment for Irish medium education. So I'm Eoin Collen, I'm Director of Initial Teacher Education at Queen's University in Belfast. I was a teacher of French, German and Spanish, and I am an active learner of the Irish language. And it's my privilege to be here today to be the discussant on the symposium. What we've seen, and I'm going to keep this really brief because I appreciate time is short and I do want to respect everyone's time, but we can see a number of big issues come into play here. Pupil experience of assessment, first and foremost, and then teachers' experience of teaching professional learning and resourcing within Irish medium education. And when we think about assessment, we often look at graphs and grades, and I want everyone to remember that behind all assessment is a little face with a life and with a story, and it's entirely incumbent on everyone in the system to make sure that we're getting language assessment right and that we're getting assessment in Irish medium education context right. We can see that there is great work going on at primary level. So from Eoin's presentation, I think that we are in a better place than we've ever been in terms of computer adaptive testing happening at primary level. The pressure point is clearly at secondary level, as we saw from Fionnghuala's presentation around translation of GCSE and A levels. What I will say about that, and if you were to go into CCEA and you were to say my name, I think colleagues would say that I'm a disruptor and like to try and challenge things along the way. I think that's good to be a friendly disruptor. But to stand and to give SIA their respect in all of this, CCEA is often very constrained by what they can do. They are funded by our Department of Education, and that's ultimately a decision that's taken at a political level by our Ministers of Education and other politicians around their funding, and they really can only do with what they can do with the funding that they're provided. So at a political level, at that macro level, it really is incumbent on our Department of Education to provide more resourcing and more funding to enable the problems that have been identified so well by Fionnghuala and Mel in their study in particular to be overcome and to be improved. In terms of teachers' experience, teacher professional learning is almost non-existent in the Irish medium sector. It's not much better in the English medium sector either, and there certainly is again another big programme of work to be done with our local Department of Education to improve teacher professional learning in both the Irish medium sector and in the English medium sector. And the resourcing for those poor Irish medium teachers that we saw so clearly in Aisling and colleagues' work is a most worrying concern. So that teacher 22 years in who's sitting at 10 o'clock at night doing their resourcing for their classes is not a good place to be. And again, we need a big funding injection to make that happen and to improve outcomes there as well. One thing that really struck me was in Fionnghuala's presentation around the College de Farsta and Gael Clash de Gora teachers offering to mark each other's GCSE and A-level examination scripts. That seems to me as an educationalist as a very sensible approach. And those of you from international contexts, so for example, if you've come from Germany, you'll know that it's often good practice in schools where the Abitur will be marked by teachers in the school who taught the pupils. There is some external moderation of that work at the Land level in the Bundesministerium for the particular Land in Germany, but that seems like a sensible solution and one that I think CCEA should easily be able to overcome, because one thing that's quite unique about CCEA is that it ultimately regulates itself, and it's a very unique body in the United Kingdom and Ireland in that it has the opportunity to regulate itself and effectively mark its own homework. Okay, so with that, I will pass over for questions from the floor, and I'm sure there are many. So we do have a roving mic here. Oh, Ashley's got it there. So have we any questions at all for the panel? And if you could just introduce yourself as well for the panel before your question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Barry O'Sullivan. I'm the Director of English Language Research at the British Council. And I would have a zillion questions. But thanks for the presentations, they were really interesting. And I have to admit that I know absolutely nothing about Irish medium education in Northern Ireland. I obviously have some, if you've heard my talk this morning, you'll know that I will not particularly love some of the cane stuff. I do like it, but I don't like the application of it always. But I thought, whoever said it, I think it might have been you, Sultan, once you put the qualitative in with the quantitative, you begin to rescue yourself. Without the qualitative, I don't think you've got anything. And I think that's one of the real strengths of what I've heard today, is really interesting qualitative work going on. As particularly the two studies, the PhD studies, I thought they were really fascinating. I do have a question though about translation. We know that from PISA, for example, they've had really significant problems over the years with translation. And it's almost impossible to get it right. And when I heard that you've got a really clearly defined construct, I thought, wow, why don't you just write them in Irish?
Yeah.
For me, that would be, that's the ideal solution. That you don't go down the translation route, because you're just introducing an opportunity for construct irrelevant variance, essentially, to use a technical term. But you're really just making life more difficult. I know it's a challenge, but what would you think?
If I may, that's really amazing. In fact, that is the organic conversation that I was referring to earlier with CCEA and Eoin. The idea of independent construction of the test. It seems to be a bit foreign when first introduced, to the land, to the context here, and it probably has some kind of colonial ties, because English is centralized. English, as Fionnghuala's presentation was illustrating, English is seen as the central language from which then the Irish, will be used to represent the construct. But definitely in these conversations, there could be an opportunity to inform policy towards independent construction, as we recommended in this panel, towards more of a sort of localized assessment model that values and empowers the learning that happens at IME schools. I'm definitely familiar with PISA and TIMS, all these transadaptations and back translation and all these sources of translation error that Guillermo Solana Flores talked about extensively, and to mitigate those kinds of challenges, I think I agree. The path forward is independent construction.
Yeah, I have to say I sort of agree. Sorry. I agree with Barry. I don't really know why the tests aren't written in Irish. Or I like your idea of having the task force to create this process where we have a quality assurance of the exams.
I think that's the problem.
And your idea about the test writing seems to be really sustainable and something that is a very a good model that most test writers would agree with. It seems like the will is here, and that is absolutely phenomenal to teach Irish and learn Irish as well. So I came to Ireland quite recently, and I've actually started learning Irish here, and there are loads of people who come to my Irish lessons from all parts of the world, not even just from Northern Ireland. So learning Irish is something that is a global need. It just seems that there's a lack of sustainability. somewhere, well, everywhere from what you said, and cohesion, and that is, not through the want of people, but through some gap somewhere in the system. And it sounds like it's a bureaucratic gap, or a gap that's coming from above. So I think your idea of creating this really cohesive, robust testing practice is a really good way forward for Irish testing in Northern Ireland. I would absolutely agree with that, but I also agree with Barry that the test should be written in Irish from the beginning, and you shouldn't be translating. I'm also a translator, and when you said that maths tests were translated, I was thinking, well, who's doing that translation? A maths teacher translating? So how would they know how to meet the needs of their learners? Because they could be translating really complex lexical items in mathematics, really complex concepts into Irish for somebody who's perhaps a lower level of Irish. And the learners in your classes, are they speaking Irish at home? So are they only speaking Irish in the school, and then they're expected to come in and do an A-level test in Irish that's been translated by a maths teacher? So there are loads of things to me that just ring huge alarm bells. And so I'm not surprised that the test takers are kind of being thrown into this kind of slight situation of chaos when they're actually taking the test. And they want to go back to the English test, as you were saying, to check the language. So but I think there are real solutions, and I think what you're proposing, this process and this quality assurance process as well, a big part of that. I think that's a really good idea.
If I may. Thanks. I'm not here to defend on a lot of the other things you've heard. That's above my pay grade. I deal with item development and content development. But yes, in terms of those CAT tests, there are and Barry, there are external pressures and drivers. Unfortunately, that we are not in control of. The likes of system level data, standardization across cohorts, and those elements that sort of we aren't in control of. Unfortunately, they're financial drivers, they're departmental drivers in those. But we are certainly trying to make our trans-adapted versions as pupil-friendly as we can, as a translation can be, and we do. It is practitioners and teachers who do carry out those translations and trans-adaptations, and the QA process is there to hopefully pick up on any issues in terms of test translation error as well. In terms of I didn't speak about the literacy test, and that is one that we are developing because Irish is different as a language, and it is one that is being developed in conjunction with schools, in collaboration with schools. Like I say, this is the first time this has been carried out, whereby we've consulted with schools about how the current practice and current best practice in the sector, in terms of what content is taught and when. And we've reached consensus with schools in terms of drawing up an assessment framework for the assessment of literacy. Unfortunately, the assessment of numeracy is not something that I can certainly influence in terms of a development, a bespoke development because of these other external drivers. I think is the only answer, Barry.
And Dr. McKendry there is a question. Just
Thanks, Dalton. I'm Eugene McKendry. I'm Ian's predecessor in the School of Education in Queen's, and as such, like Ian, was concerned not only with Irish but languages in general. And I think we'll find just Northern Ireland, the Republic, the UK generally, language teaching in general is facing great challenges. And the irony, I suppose, in some ways, is that Irish medium education can claim to be a success. in that it has proceeded, it has developed. But sometimes, and again, looking at my background, both in primary and post-primary and teacher education, I have sometimes a concern that even it has run ahead of itself in the success, and we've heard a bit of that today, in providing schools with its difficulty in finding teachers. Perhaps in the primary sector, with what St Mary's provides, there are teachers available, but we know that post-primary and across the curriculum, there are real concerns and real difficulties. And that being a success, but facing so many problems such as we saw today, can I, to the panel, give you another greater problem that will keep us working for as long as you wish? Because I think it's Fionnghuala who was saying there that one of the issues is pupils, when you leave primary Irish medium, transferring to post-primary English medium. And that brings forth a great set of other problems in assessment and so on, which has nothing to do with Irish medium sector itself. It's to do with assessment of Irish in particular in the English medium sector, where we're now getting a cohort of children who are pupils who have been through Irish medium, find themselves in English medium schools. So when it comes to GCSE and A-level, etc., the bar has been raised so high that for people coming from English language schools, where there are pupils from an Irish medium background, it is horribly and terribly skewed. And there's a big issue there, but it is not the issue of concern for today. I suppose finally, the only thing I can say is that, yes, the problems are there. It's amazed me, and God help me, I'm looking back over 50 years of it. I remember the setting up of Bunsell Farstons, Bunskill, Bohusoy and so on, and the fact that it has developed so much. But that always in the back of my mind has been a certain concern. It's keeping up with that success. And I suppose it's something that's a challenge of people like myself or yourselves. Not myself anymore, I'm retired. But it is an ongoing and will be an ongoing concern that the success is there, but my gosh, we've heard the challenges as well.
Thank you, Eugene. Would anyone like to respond to Eugene? Any comments or Ashley? No? Or any other questions?
Yeah, I'd just like to say that you are doing a brilliant job, and I was able to learn Irish quite well in my school in Armagh, so yeah, I'd just like to thank you for that.
Why, great. Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, I don't know, I don't want to waste time if there are other questions, but I just wanted to come back to our reason for being here to start with was that we wanted to present what we had to an international audience who will be able to support and help us, I think, in relation to developments that clearly need to be made. What's really striking for me is it is absolutely, excuse the phrase, a no-brainer that we need, the construct that we're looking at here is Irish. And I am delighted that that has been said out loud by someone else and by such a very strong audience such as yourselves. But therein lies a bit of our problem. It's how that construct has been valued over time and is currently valued by our politicians. I am not a politician, but we had to go and present evidence to the Education Committee and Education Committee in our Parliament, in our local Parliament, and there were some members of the committee who just refused to engage with us, refused to listen to the evidence that we presented. So it is construct, above all and above everything from this morning, as you were saying, Barry, it is most certainly construct, but it's how do we move forward, I think, in being able to recognise that it is, dare I say it, just a construct in some ways, and being able to move things around. And I think this particular symposium, and I really want to thank my colleagues, it always is a very, very strong team effort for being part of that, because I think it allows us to look with a little bit of distance at that construct, as well as hearing very closely from practitioners as well. So, so that's all I wanted to add.
Oh, you go first.
Okay, I'm not sure, I can only encourage you in your efforts to create your own test, because if you make your own test and if you do it well, then your learners will be able to show what they can do. It will be very rewarding for them. And I can only give you one example for a high stakes test in my country. We introduced centralized testing about 15 years ago. but that meant that we had to train item writers, and that took about 5 years, 3 years, the full project, then another 2 or 3 years of piloting. And now that it's out for about 7 years, we have a pass rate of well beyond 90%, plus about half of the test takers who do really, really well in the language test of English as a second language. That's a different matter, but it's also because there is, much brain work going into it. So if you do it really well, and if you do it in Irish, it will be ever so rewarding for your test takers as well, I think, and will sort of catch on more momentum even, and so on and so forth. So I'd like to encourage you in your efforts there.
Yeah, I just want to echo, and it would reflect the ways of knowing and learning and being, talking, writing in Irish, through Irish and in Irish. I totally agree.
Great, thank you, Sultan. We'll pass over to the chair then, just to close the symposium. So
Okay,
thank you.
thank you so much for this amazing, intriguing papers and brilliant effort beneath them. I guess we should give our children